horrible disparities in healthcare exist in this city and around the country due to the profit motive of the healthcare system. You look at people who don't have places to live in a country that has more vacant homes than there are people who live in the streets who are houseless. So all these connections exist. And so I think the question for us is like, how do we as working people interact with that, particularly with our coworkers who maybe aren't who are also watch the news, but maybe aren't yet political, maybe haven't like tracked the specific things, the dynamics. Maybe they buy the narrative from the dominant media and politicians that this all started on October 7th, when, as we know, it started way before then. And so again, that was the kind of the purpose and purview of this discussion. And so we have a few speakers here, a couple speakers who are going to kind of go into more depth about some of the work that they've been doing. I've got Aisha Patel, fellow CTU member, teacher here in Chicago, and I have a colleague here, Rashid Kasia. He's a physician also at County, and both of these are union members. Rashid is a member of the Doctors Council, which is an SEIU local. So without further ado, basically what we're going to do is each of us will talk I already talked a little bit, but I'll let Aisha and Rashid talk a little bit, and then I think we could open it up to the conversation to the audience to kind of talk about what their reflections on what we're sharing here. So without further ado, I'll give it to Aisha.
Thanks, Dennis. Hi, everyone. My name is Aisha. I use she, her pronouns. I am going into my third year of teaching. I teach high school history in Chicago Public Schools. And just a little bit of background, I'm born and raised in Chicago, South Asian background. And I organize with the local bail fund called Believers Bailout, as well as education organizing around Palestine, part of a collective with Dennis of educators in the Chicagoland area called Chicago Educators for Palestine. And I'm new to union labor organizing just because I just joined the union a couple years ago, but I'm learning a lot and seeing the importance of mobilizing within these spaces. And I had the privilege of attending the People's Conference for Palestine a few months ago, and that kind of learning about labor organizing that's been happening around Palestine for decades really kind of like reinvigorated my my will to fight for this. And so some of the things that we've been working on as Chicago educators, specifically around union and labor organizing, is one, looking into our pension and any divestment we can do around Israel. If you don't know, the American Federation of Teachers, one of the largest unions in the U.S., one of the largest teachers unions in the U.S., recently just divested their Israel bond, which is great, yes, and there's still pressure being put onto them to commit to not investing in future Israel bonds, which they haven't done yet, but and then, so we're looking into like our CTU pension and figuring out like how we can go around divesting in any Israel-related investments that we have as Chicago Teachers Union members. And then the other thing is a lot of school districts around the U.S. Have partnerships with the Anti-Defamation League, and CPS specifically does partner with them and has had professional developments around just like SEL or socio-emotional work. And so we're looking into how to drop the ADL as a vendor and really just being mindful in terms of like the partnerships that we have as educators, and also just like the work that we do in the classroom, right? Like for me, it's really important that I talk about Palestine in the classroom as a history teacher, but also in a county where we have the largest Palestinian diaspora population in the United States. So like, I'm always thinking about like, what are we doing to center the voices of our Palestinian students, of our Palestinian teachers? And so I'm really grateful that we have an incredible community of educators, both within and outside of the classroom, that are coming together to continue this fight.
I'm Rashid Kaisia. I'm a ER doctor at Cook County Hospital and Lebanese Palestinian. Oh. How about now? Oh, there it goes. Hi, Rashid Kaisia. I'm an ER doctor at Cook County Hospital and Lebanese Palestinian by background. And I guess I wanted to talk about just the healthcare situation in Palestine and what a misappropriation of our money it is to just create systematic genocide. And you know, like just last night working, I had a patient who was seen at an outside hospital, spent 2 months trying to find cancer care, and then presented at county last night. He had isolated cancer in his kidney 2 months ago, and now has metastatic cancer everywhere. Well, it was admitted for pain control. It was essentially is going to get palliative care at this point. And you know, while we're spending, we just, you know, I think $20 billion is the most recent allocation for weapons to destroy healthcare and everything else in Palestine. We have no security net for our own patients. We have no semblance of universal health care or protection in this country. You see 50% of bankruptcies in this country are related to medical bankruptcy. So, you know, and to compound the crime of what is happening back home, there's the crime of what we're not doing for our own people here. With the money that has been spent elsewhere in Palestine, you know, it's a most systematic targeting of healthcare that I've seen in my lifetime. You know, and my first memory of politics was basically the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. You know, I lost my uncle, I lost my cousin in that conflict, and I've, you know, been watching this horror show for, you know, my entire life, and this is easily the most concentrated and miserable phase of what we've seen. It's really an extermination phase that we're seeing for Palestinians. There are over 500 healthcare workers that have been killed, and it's not just killed. It really should stress that it's targeting of those, in addition to targeting the press, in addition to targeting schools and other infrastructural things, water, everything has been deliberately targeted. But healthcare, among other things, it has been deliberately targeted. There were 36 working hospitals in Gaza. There are now 12 standing hospitals. Just as an example, I was trying to go to Gaza to work, and literally all of the organizations that I tried to sign up with, they either had to pull out because they've been targeted, or they just have no space to work now. You know, one organization was working out of tents, and their tent was targeted. So, you know, there's a complete healthcare infrastructure collapse, in addition to the collapse of everything else that's happened there. And you know, just I guess that's all I have to say about that.
No, I definitely appreciate that. And I think, you know, the thing that many of us ask ourselves is we see what's happening in Palestine, and I think we try and figure out, like, how can we do something about that here? I think we understand why. Like, we understand that this government is backing Israel to the hilt, financially, politically, internationally, with our tax dollars. And those tax dollars could be used to do things like provide national health care. Like, for all the things that we have in this society, this is one of the societies of all around the world where you can actually you can go bankrupt from not having health care. It's the number one cause for bankruptcy, like Rashid was saying. We have some of the lowest life expectancies because of healthcare, because of the lack of funding for healthcare, because it's all built around making money and not around meeting people's needs. And so that's a fundamental problem we have in this society. And that to say that we have a budget that just doesn't go towards Israel, but goes towards the military in general, is a real thing. And those things are not something that we have democratic control over directly. Like, besides the fact that we don't actually elect our president directly, it's an electoral college that does that. I thought it was outrageous how the press secretary last week was talking about how, isn't it terrible that in Venezuela, the person who got the most votes isn't being put into president? It made me think, well, isn't that what happened in the year 2000? And again in 2016, the person who got the less votes is the winner somehow. But we're the greatest democracy in the world, and we're going to drop bombs to tell the people how they should live their lives. So it's complete hypocrisy on so many levels in this country when it comes to how it treats its own people and the kinds of things that it funds internationally. So, but the question, I think, is, like, how do we as workers interact with that? Like, there's obviously protesting is important, getting out in the streets is important, but what are the levers of power that we have as working people to stop this funding of this genocide, I think is a question that many of us are trying to grapple with. And before I turn over to the audience to kind of share and ask questions, some of the things that we've been doing as part of the Chicago Labor Network for Palestine is starting with education. Because most people, what they receive in education is by the mass media, it's by politicians, it's this myth that things started not in 1948 or even before then, actually 1914 if you want to get real with it, but on October 7th somehow. And that Hamas is a terrorist organization that's anti-Semitic, and all the rest of it. All those lies are being put out there by mainstream media and by politicians. And so how do we cut against that, I think, with our coworkers who are horrified by what they see in terms of the murder of children, of men and women, of people who are, just trying to exist in Gaza and in the West Bank, by the way, but feel powerless to do so. They feel like that's out of their reach. Obviously, when you look at the electoral arena, there's not much option. You're going to vote for Trump or Kamala, the person who basically maybe has more feelings of sorrow in terms of what's happening in Gaza, but really has not stopped the arming of Israel. Like, if you really wanted to stop the arming of Israel, the U.S. government could literally stop sending bombs, and the war would not be able to be continued. They literally cannot continue without the support of the United States. So the question is, if we don't have the electoral power, if we don't have, what are the next steps that we can take? So that's what we've been kind of focusing on, the Chicago Labor Network, and then some of the educators for Palestine, healthcare workers for Palestine, is by talking to coworkers and colleagues about these issues and saying, okay, what is the next step that we can take? Some of the things we did in the Chicago Teachers Union very early was we passed a resolution. And again, that may seem kind of meaningless in the sense of it didn't stop Netanyahu from continuing to promote genocide in Gaza and the West Bank, but at least it sets a marker. It makes people feel more confident, say, well, my union actually came out and called for a ceasefire. The city council, with a tiebreaker, and that gives confidence to people. As a small move as it may be, I think it does give confidence to people. And I think the question then is, beyond giving confidence, what are some of the actions that we can take? Aisha talked about divestment. I think that's something that has been talked about for a long time when it comes to the issue of showing solidarity with Palestine, the boycott, sanctions, and divestment. Many unions and our pension funds are invested in things like either war profiteers or directly in the state of Israel. So that's an arena where we can start to pull back on the funds. And that's something that goes back to a historical fight that took place in terms of solidarity during apartheid South Africa. In apartheid South Africa, which was very similar to the situation, the colonial settler project of Afrikaners to take land from Black South Africans and oppress them and exploit the miners in particular and workers in South Africa. But there was a solidarity movement which took place in this country, in particular of unions, to do things like we're going to support strikes, and we're going to stop shipping lines that have relationships with South African companies. So those are some of the examples that we can also have seen also recently with like Block the Boat, where in the Bay Area, they can have what's called a safety strike, where there's so many people near the dock that the ship can't be unloaded safely by the longshore people, and so they basically said, well, it's unsafe to go to work, so we're not going to go to work. So that's another example, more recently, of workers taking concrete strike action in terms of showing solidarity with Gaza. I think the question for us is how can we escalate that to more workplaces? Because most of our coworkers, they come to work to pay the rent, to put food on the table, to support their families. They're not necessarily thinking about their job as a political arena, and they're not thinking about their power as workers in that sense. And so I think part of our job is also saying, what is the power that we have as workers in our society? What is our relationship to the way that our society works? And can we use our power as workers to impact the direction the society is going? So these are some obviously wider questions and longer things that we need to grapple with in terms of activism, and how do we connect the issue of workplace organizing with bigger issues, international issues like Palestine. But I think we have to begin by starting to talk about them and by organizing with our coworkers to educate them, and then talking about what are some of the actions that they can take that make sense. Like earlier, before we kind of started, we were talking about, could there be a general strike for Palestine? That would be amazing. I would love to see a general political strike for Palestine. We saw an example of that in California, where the grad student workers in 4811, which is the UAW local, did take strike action. But it was also very specific, just so people who may not be familiar with it. There was encampments that were taking place where students were occupying campuses with tents to basically say, we want our universities to stop investing in Israel. And the universities, and LA, for example, UCLA was the most extreme example, where the police were sent in with the blessing of the board to basically violently remove people. And so it was on that basis that they said, well, we as workers have an interest in free speech. We as workers have an interest in being able to peacefully assemble and put our demands forward. And that's why they were able to convince their coworkers, who maybe were or were not necessarily seeing Palestine as a labor issue, but they did see it very specifically in that, and then were able to take solidarity around that issue of free speech as it directly related to protesting for Palestine. So I think those are some specific examples recently of people who are taking action, and I'd be really curious to know what other people's reflections on what Aisha and Rashid were sharing, and maybe some examples they themselves have been engaged in around workers' solidarity with Palestine. So with that, I'll pass the mic around with anybody who wanted to either ask a question or make a comment or whatever with the time that we have left.
Hi, thanks for sharing your thoughts. I'm wondering if each of you could discuss sort of how you both sort of educate your membership, like union membership or whatever your labor force looks like, and then how do you convince folks that the intersection of these items are relevant to the lack of underfunding that we experience, or the lack of under-resourcedness that we experience as laborers in these places, and if you could be as specific, as detailed as you can. And then I guess, I don't know how many of you are in unions or not, but like how often are you in more of like a skill sharing with other unions, right? Because I think a lot of it is, I think, you know, we know CTU's got muscle and has been exercising that for a long time. How are we sharing those learnings across different sectors of labor?
I've just spoke a bunch. It's your turn. Want to answer the question?
So I'm part of a collective called Chicago Educators for Palestine, and many of us are CTU members. And I think so the two big initiatives we're working on right now are like pension divestment and dropping the Anti-Defamation League as a vendor. So we're not necessarily at the point right now where we are getting like a larger group of people involved within the union, just because we want to be really intentional about the research that we're doing and the education that we're doing first, so that we can like kind of fully explain to other folks like why this is such an important issue. And I think like, especially within the Chicago Teachers Union, it's really helpful because the union has been so powerful and has advocated so much historically. And I think especially when the union like pushed to divest the pension from like fossil fuels, I think that sets a really important precedent for us in terms of like talking about how connected these things are. Like you can't talk about fossil fuel divestment as a separate issue from like Israel divestment, right? Like all of these things are connected, and I think that just using like the historical advocacy of the union is going to be really important, like as we continue doing this research and doing this work.
And I wish I had something more to say about the Doctors' Council in terms of activity. So I guess what I would say is just more generally, organizing is really the fulcrum that we have in this country for our own needs and for pressuring policy change abroad. I think it's Malcolm X that said that we're not outnumbered, we're out organized, I think an important aspect is just to keep emphasizing to coworkers that really organizing is their fulcrum to change their situation. So in the workplace, it's really just trying to educate and trying to get people to make the connections that what's happening to you here is really in a continuum with what we're seeing abroad. And really Gaza is a lab, and we should all be looking at that lab with horror, really, not just for the human disaster of what it is, but that how AI is being applied for targeting, how information and artificial intelligence is being used for control. And then to bring that back home, like you see the efforts like Cop City, where those IDF and Israeli intelligence efforts are now, being brought. They're being brought. Those individuals are being brought here to teach our police how to control populations in our country, and including, building a fake urban city outside of Atlanta to train police officers here in the same techniques that the IOF uses in Gaza against our population there. So it's not only a horror show, watching what's happened to civilians there, but we should all be watching that and thinking about how that's going to impact, things as we try to leverage for our rights here. I think that we should all be concerned seeing how, what that looks like, because that's the model for how you control a population. And if that population is our black and brown and poor people and workers in this country, then that's the model that will be applied to us eventually here.
Hi, I was wondering if you've had any experiences. You said you teach about Palestine in your classroom, of Zionist parents of kids or the school system pushing back against you, and any advice you have for teachers unions and broader community support to organize to protect the job security of teachers who teach about Palestine.
So I have been really lucky and grateful that I haven't gotten any pushback from parents, from students, from admin at all in my experience, and so like that's kind of pushed me to continue talking about it, right? So like the first day that I kind of brought it up in my classroom was after the murder of Wadi al-Fayoum. Back in October, and so I like sat with my students, asked them if they knew like what had happened, because although like this genocide was taking place thousands of miles away, we were seeing the immediate effects like in our backyard, right? And so we talked about kind of just like historically setting some context for the occupation and for the genocide, and then with a lot of teenagers, their question is always like, okay, but why does it matter? Why should I care? And I encourage my students to ask that. Like, if your teacher is going to be teaching you something, there should be a reason they're teaching you that. And it's okay for you to ask your teacher, why should I care? Why am I learning this? And so, we talked about how even though these things are happening thousands of miles away, our tax money is funding this genocide. Our tax money is funding free healthcare there when we don't have it here. The police that terrorize our black and brown communities here go and they learn from the IOF and they bring those tactics back here, right? And so that was like kind of the first introduction. And for me, it's really important, like, not that I just constantly talk about it, but like it's visible in my classroom. I have a flag, like I wear my earrings, and I like, just like a quick story about these earrings. I was like sitting at my desk once and a kid walks in and she was like, Ms. Patel, why, like, those are really cool earrings, like, why are you wearing them? So I told her about like the story of the watermelon and how the Palestinian flag was banned and they used the watermelon as like a form of resistance and expression of their identity. And like her response was really funny. She was like, gosh, why is Israel always doing some shit? And I was like, you're right, like, yeah, why? But like even just like wearing things, right, as a form of like expression, and it starts conversations with my students in terms of like what people can do to like kind of fight back against that. I think just like having solidarity like between people within your workspace, right? Like I am glad like I have a really strong department within the social studies department at my school that would have my back if anything happened, right? But I know not all school districts or all teachers have that luxury, and I know that JVP and the Palestinian legal organization are also really like advocating for teachers that have gotten a lot of pushback, that have lost their jobs. But I think also like just being part of like Chicago Teachers Union and having that protection is also really helpful and important. So I know that didn't necessarily answer your entire question, but.
Yeah, I had a question. I think like, and this goes for really anybody. I mean, like if you're part of a bigger union and like how you kind of overcome that inertia, and I think especially as they're trying to like rev up, and I think a lot of unions are connected to the Democratic Party, so like trying to, deflect that, because we know there's not good candidates in the case of, really what's going on in the Middle East or really anywhere for working class people. So I guess just like any kind of experience or advice to kind of like, buck that trend and be more about just more pro-worker, non-voting mobilizations and activities that the unions can be involved in.
No, I think that's a key question. I think that's confronting everybody in our country right now, is like, where does our power lie? Does it lie in the ballot box? And it's such a narrow thing. I mean, before Kamala was the candidate, it was literally a contest between two old white dudes who were literally, it was like a joke. Like, this is the greatest thing that our democracy can produce, is Biden and Trump. And so I can understand the argument that Kamala is better in the sense that she's more likely to beat Trump for the people who want to beat Trump. And I certainly can understand the taking pleasure in seeing Trump, who's a racist, sexist piece of shit, being defeated electorally by Kamala Harris. On the same token, Kamala Harris is not going to bring a different set of politics to this country, as evidenced by her participation in the previous administration. And so I think it begs the question, like, where does our power lie, and how do we push that forward? And it's a constant thing that we have to figure out. And the more that we can do, whether it's in union or non-union workspaces, I think, to build that confidence of our coworkers that we can have a say. I mean, look at all the amazing organizing that's happening in the Starbucks Workers United union right now. That company, I'm sorry to swear, that has been trying to stop them have started to be pushed back. And I think part of that has been the issue of Palestine. The boycott against Starbucks because of the relationship with Israel has boosted the union's position in many people's views. And I think so the phrase that Palestine will liberate us all is really something to kind of think about and grapple with. Raising the issues of political questions within our workspaces has forced the Chicago Teachers Union to take a position on supporting protesters. We had a unanimous vote in our last house, which is our structure of our union, to support protesters and who are doing encampments across this country. And that's an important thing to market to set out. Like, we have the right to protest, we have the right to organize. So I guess my thing is, like, whatever you can do with your coworkers to push back against an asshole boss and fight for any little piece of land does give their confidence. Say, actually, we as regular people have the power. Because you look at the history, and I'll wrap up on this, anything that's decent in this history has come about because regular people stood up and fought for it. Slavery was not ended because people said, oh, this is really bad, we don't like this anymore. It's because people organized and fought tooth and nail with their bodies on the line to end slavery. Women were not given the right to vote because they asked very nicely to get the right vote, because they struck, they fought, they marched, they made this country ungovernable until they were able to get the right to vote. Gay people, to get the right to marry, did not have because they asked about it for nicely. Again, anything that's decent has come about because regular people stood up and fought for it. And that's the lesson that they don't want us to take in. They want us to just say, oh, just pull the lever every 4 years for whatever least worst jerk that we put in front of you. But we can have so much more in our history in this country has shown us that possibility. So we need to keep pushing on that. And I think that's what will get us not just better lives, but things like a free Palestine. More comments and questions. I see some amazing activists out here, so I know there's people out here who have things to share about stuff they've been doing, so I want people to share. And I'll start calling you by name if I need to. I see two comrades here that I know who organized an amazing education series that was targeted towards raising people's consciousness and information on Palestine. I'm just going to hand you a mic to talk about it if no one else puts their hand up. Come on. All right.
Hi. I think the biggest thing that I have a question about now is just like, how do we organize a general strike for Palestine? I think that it was something that was like very broadly called for by Palestinian activists and journalists during like as far back as November and December. And there wasn't a broader support for that. So like getting the support from Chicago Teachers Union, getting support from UAW, getting support from like established unions within the United States to actually stop giving our labor to the state for even just one full day in support of Palestine. Like what does the path towards that look like in your guys' opinion, or anyone else who is here? Because I think that really needs to be our next lever.
Or someone in the audience, please. That's a great question. How do we organize? How can we go about organizing a general strike for Palestine? I would love to have that conversation.
I honestly feel like it's where the wealth differential in this country is just worsening and worsening, and I always try to be an optimist, but it's like I've inculcated 50 years of pessimism in terms of how my particular issue is seen in this country. But this is the first time in my lifetime that I've seen like general awareness of Palestine as an issue, and just compare it to kind of during the Gulf War. What I saw is the atmosphere here after 9/11, what the atmosphere was. I think this is the first time that people are starting to become aware of it. I think that the intersection with how people's lives in this country are affected by those same forces is really where things have to go for this spark to really ignite. And I think that the ruling elite are making it easy for us, because the general conditions in this country have just worsened and worsened, and I think that they're laying the groundwork for us in terms of just watching our quality of living and our general status as everybody else that isn't in that 2% that's making more and more. So I really think that we're starting to watch the groundwork for where we have to be, and it's just a question of are we able to effectively start putting those putting all the intersections together, and understanding that that we're approaching a period where these people are going to defend what they have against our, the 99% of the population that does not have it, and we have to be ready and we should be expecting that things will get worse for us, and that worsening is really the groundwork for where we have to go. We're either going to allow the Jeff Bezoses of the world to continue to not provide for their workforce, and we just all become gig workers in one fashion or another. Like physicians are backward as a political group as a whole, but just watching in the last 10 years, we've become entirely corporatized, and we've become well-paid gig workers is what's happened now, and you've seen just a general degradation of our specialty at the cost of our patients. So you just, you see a lot of moral injury where a lot of us just don't feel like we're doing the same job that I came into medicine to do. I can't provide for patients in a way that I want to. They can't provide them with the resources. There's no follow-up mechanisms for them to get help. There's, so I think it's not just medicine. It's not just for teachers. I think all of us are watching a general decline in our workplace status and our quality of living, and that's at the that's not incidental. It's at the cost of a very small group of people that are benefiting more and more. And if you look at the wealth differential in this country, we're now exceeded what it looked like in the Gilded Age for wealth differential, and that's not going to get better. It's going to get worse. So I think the future is really like just us, understanding how all of it relates, all of it relates together, and organizing to be prepared for what's coming, because it's I think it's bleak if we don't have organization to push back. Yeah.
Anyone else want to share on that question? Or okay, go ahead, Joel, and back here.
Yeah, I think it's, we talking about these organizations, these unions, these industrial unions. I think we need to be ready to really, if we want to get to the point of a general strike, it really means mobilizing the rank and file around more militant lines and being ready to win the membership of these unions away from the leadership, which in lots of ways, represents a very ensconced and privileged position in society, and they're not really going to allow it. So I think really mobilizing the rank and file to more militant line and being ready to outstrip the leadership of a lot of misleaders at the top of unions is really going to be necessary. And I think, talking about, general strike and like a general strike and leading to more revolutionary situations, that we're going to shut down capitalism and we're not going to let it come back on, like it's going to be, so, but I think, I think just, again, just speaking what we've already talked about, expanding like the limits of what we think is possible. I mean, they want to talk about elections. We want to talk about direct actions and work stoppages and slowdowns and wildcat strikes. Like, it's just got to be ready to understand our own power and understand that even, the leadership that say that they represent our interests are really putting the brakes on a lot of the forward progress that these organizations, these industrial organizations, really can create.
I had another question. Is that cool? So in a local labor union in my area that regularly speaks at the local Palestine rallies, there's this one white labor dude who always gets up to speak, and he's like, our labor is not Team Palestine, not Team Israel, we're Team Humanity. And yeah. And so I wanted to ask if you've had experiences talking to your students or talking to your fellow workers about Palestinians' right to resist, the fact that Hamas is not a terrorist organization, it's a counter-terrorist organization, because I feel like in my experience in working with broader mass organizations such as unions, people actually can hop on the ceasefire bandwagon pretty easily, but then we just get into cycles of empire all over again because they believe two-state solution, Israel should keep existing, both sides are bad, there's this normalization, this false equivalency. So how do you make sure that in your classroom and in your unions, the conversation about freeing Palestine is actually about the abolition of Israel?
So I think for me, okay, so I teach world studies and US history. In my world studies class, I ended on a unit on genocide. And so typically most schools or school districts will, when they talk about genocide, it's typically the Holocaust. I decided in addition to the Holocaust, we should be talking about so many other genocides that have also existed. And so in total, we did case studies of 8 different genocides. And so when we looked at each of the genocides, we looked at what led to the genocide, kind of creating some context, what happened during the genocide, who committed the genocide, what was the US response to the genocide, what was the global response to the genocide, and what we have seen and what my students, like, without me having said anything, they themselves realize that the US response and the majority global response has historically just been doing nothing or continuing to invest in and support the genocide. And so we have also looked at resistance, right? The curriculum that I used didn't have Palestine as a genocide listed, and so I kind of created the curriculum materials to include that. And so and even before then, right, we've talked about resistance to European colonization in Africa, right? Like I don't shy away from like talking about these like violent resistance movements because we know that historically they have existed, and that's not something that, and like kids should be learning about that, right? I teach older kids, like they can learn about this stuff. We talk about so many heavy topics, and so I think that has been really helpful for me, is to put this genocide in the context of other genocides throughout history, and really creating an understanding that the US specifically has never done anything to stop these genocides. And it's really just been internally the people resisting that have led to the end of the genocides and like, creation of the systems that they want.
And I think that's correct in the sense that this country and its media and the politicians and education systems, they just want to show one side. Like when Russia invaded Ukraine, this country was all about the Ukrainian resistance. We got to mourn the deaths of Ukrainians who are being killed by Russians. We have to lift up the soldiers who are resisting the invasion by this foreign body. But then when it's Palestine, it's a whole different story somehow. We don't talk about that in the same context. We don't talk about that as being correct or valid or justified on any stretch. I think that's it's horrible, a horrible contradiction and hypocrisy that this country often does. And if you look at the question of the Holocaust, there was something called the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where all kinds of means were used by Jewish people who were being put in an open-air concentration camp to resist against the Nazis who were trying to repress them. And so we absolutely have to talk about how it is justified for people who are being oppressed to resist that oppression. And there's a rich history of that happening in this country too. When it came to Native people or indigenous people who were resisting westward expansion by the colonial powers. And just to touch back on the question of general strike and like how do we get there? I guess the question that I think about as an organizer is how do we scale up to that? There certainly have been histories of massive strikes in this country, but they go back decades. I mean, in CTU, in the last one thing that we joke about in CTU is like, oh, you got a job in CPS? Are you going on strike yet? Because it is kind of a thing. Like I've been in CPS since 2016, and I've been on strike 3 times, 2019, 2020, and then 2021. The last 2 are over the question of the pandemic and reopening of schools. And so the point I'm trying to make here is it's around very specific things that workers are typically interested in going out on strike. In 2019, it certainly was around economic issues, but the way that we talked about it and the way that we actually organized it was around the schools that our communities deserve. One of the main issues that we fought around in the 2019 strike was a nurse in every school. That's not about just higher pay and some greedy unionist trying to get a little bit more money so they can buy that, nice refrigerator for their basement wet bar or whatever. It's about actually increasing the quality of life for the students that exist in Chicago. And so you had all kinds of teachers who were maybe just thinking about that wet bar fridge, but they also had to think about, wait a minute, actually all our schools should have a nurse, because why the hell not? It's happening in all the suburbs. So I think it's a question of like, how do we link together political questions to economic questions for people who maybe aren't automatically making those connections, because our society doesn't teach them that. It doesn't teach them that they themselves have power as workers. It doesn't teach them that there's connections between what this government does here and what it does abroad. It doesn't talk about the fact that half of our tax dollars go towards murder. That's like our military budget. And then billions of dollars go to specifically right now to murder people in Gaza. And so we need to make those connections and then link that back to how do we scale up our activities. So we've done the resolution. Okay, so what do we do next? Is it divestment? Is it organizing a strike? Like there was one school in the Bay Area that did go out on a strike for Palestine. It was a very small thing. There's been these actions taking place in the ports. So how do we scale up our activities to get to the point where people who aren't necessarily at where we're at in this room, but we can get them one step closer to us so we get to that level where we can actually do political strikes. Because it's happened before in this country. It will happen again. Like Rashid was saying, I think there's going to be an economic crisis and a need-based thing that pushes people toward that activity. But how do we put those politics forward to lay the basis for those kinds of fights moving forward is a question we should start thinking about and talking about with our coworkers right now, whether we're in a union or not.
Just a quick note on making your union work for you if you do have a union. Just a book that I recommend is No Shortcuts, Jay McAlevey. And that's just an excellent book on how to get your union from being just a body that goes and negotiates a COLA adjustment, or pushes back against cutting your health care or raising adding $200 to your copay, and actually making it work for your situation. It's a very nuts and bolts book, so if you haven't read that, that's a great book. I've been recently discovered that it really does it's a nuts and bolts. How do you make your union actually work as an organizing body, and not just a couple of union reps that are paid professionals that negotiate some small potato changes for your situation.
I saw a hand up over here. Oh, thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for being here today and speaking to your experiences, labor-specific experiences. I wonder, what can student organizers learn from, labor union organizers, especially as the school year starts? I guess in my mind, the first thing that comes to mind, and if there are any strategies y'all have shared with the students that you worked with, in my mind is with the encampments, there were a lot of young student organizers, probably for the first time, being in rooms with administrators, having to kind of negotiate, right, for the demands that they had. So I don't know if there's been tips for what bargaining negotiations have looked like for unions, that students could take tactics from, things like that. Yeah, if there's any kind of crossover in the work that you do with the students.
I think students were inspiring to us, to be frank. I thought when the encampment started in Chicago, it was oh my God, this is so amazing. Leading the way, taking on this issue directly, putting people's bodies on the line and occupying space. I was fortunate enough to have a job where I could, I get done with work at 2:33 most days. I can go to the encampments. Going to talk to the students at Northwestern was so impressive and amazing, and how they beat back this Zionist onslaught where they attempted to try and clear them out. And then I was able to go to the University of Chicago, where they also, and I saw many of these people who were in this room down there as well, showing solidarity and support for those students. Going to the School of Our Institute for the brief time that they occupied that space on Michigan Avenue was also instructive, in seeing how the police and how violent that this Art Institute was in repressing that thing. And then also DePaul was near one of the schools I work at, so I was able to go there on several occasions and show support. And one of the things we did is we formed a labor contingent and just picked the day. Say, hey, anyone who's in a union, come out to this DePaul encampment, wear your union swag. We did a little educational speak out about why we're here and support for them. But to be honest, it was me taking more inspiration from the students than the other way around. And the last thing I'll say on that is, and then maybe we can take a couple final comments from the panel, is that many of them are unionized. At Northwestern, the grad students are unionized. At U of C, the grad students are unionized. DePaul, there's union drive happening amongst campus workers currently, and so there's many links between working class struggles and the struggles in support of Palestine that are really important to make the connections. So I know we're getting we want to wrap these things up, so I just want to give Aisha and Rashida a minute or so, a couple minutes to just kind of share some final thoughts before we close this out.
I also just want to echo what Dennis was saying. I was so incredibly inspired by this student movement organizing that was happening. And then also within CPS, right? We had high school students that led walkouts to go to City Hall to, advocate for this ceasefire resolution. And I think there's so much narrative about Gen Z being however Gen Z is. But I think we really, I always tell my students, you guys are the future. There's so much that you can do, and there's so much that you have the power to do. And so just kind of combating those narratives about all this shit talking that's happening about Gen Z, and really getting them to understand that they have so much power, and they can really fight to create the world that they want to live in, right? We're doing that, but they are the future. So they're the next generation to do that.
I guess the one thing I would say is just in my lifetime of watching how much quiescence we've had for such a long period of time, and from the Gulf War until this recent George Floyd and subsequently even the losses, you learn from the losses, and I think that this generation is getting a much more concentrated exposure to organizing, maybe losing from that organization effort. I mean, of all the mobilization that happened after the George Floyd murder, you know, like what did we get from it? Increased police funding is what the, you know, ultimately, you know, like came out of it. But, you know, from, you know, starting with Ferguson and, you know, until now, there's just been a higher frequency of those episodes. And even though, like, we're not, you know, you don't see the direct impact, it's the most hopeful I've been in my lifetime, really, of seeing, like, at least, like, the you know, the higher frequency of people standing up. And even if we're, you know, even if we lose, there's lessons that are being learned, and, you know, you have to lose sometimes to learn lessons, and then the, you know, that, you know, hopefully is lays the groundwork for winning in the future. So I think that, you know, there's no doubt that we won't see it in our lifetimes, and hopefully the lessons learned, you know, build a basis for, you know, for the next spark, and, you know, eventually little sparks, you know, start a fire. Yeah.
Yeah, and just finally to say, I know that this event and what's happening this coming week is because we're here to protest the DNC. And so that's an important lesson and connection I think many people across this country are making, is that the two parties that exist don't actually represent the interest of regular working people, and we need to build an alternative to that. It could be an alternative in the streets, it could be an alternative in terms of independent political organizations, like I'm part of the 50th Ward IPO here in Chicago. I'm sure other people are also maybe part of neighborhood organizations, but the main lesson I think we can come away from this week hopefully taking in is that regular people just like ourselves can make history, can make change, and the connections that people are making between what's happening in Palestine, what's happening here, between US imperialism and capitalism and climate change are really important, and the life-lasting changes in that the two parties that dominate our society are not what we deserve. We need to fight for so much more, and we can and will do so if we continue to struggle together. So thank you all again for listening to this presentation and talking with us.
Okay, hello everyone. Just 1 second. So yeah, first of all, yes, fuck the GNC. And thank you all so much for coming to day one of the Fuck the GNC conference book fair. We'll be here tomorrow as well for another day of the book fair, and we'll also have a really awesome conference opening panel at 2:30. We'll have some guests from the Chicago Torture Justice Center, from Not Me We, and some other really cool special guests. So we would love if you all come back tomorrow and bring your friends and join us for all of our programming throughout the whole week. Thank you all so much.